In the list of the most iconic female characters in cinema history, Sarah Connor and Ripley stand close to each other. These characters led to franchises mostly curated towards female leads, even though hardly any would live up to Ripley or Sarah Connor. Sarah is one of the finest examples of someone who took on a battle that was forced onto her because of her legacy, and she did manage to save humanity even though she faced threats to her own life and her family. Over the years, we've had the chance to see a lot of arcs where she was explored, and each time a different storyline was focused upon for the character. Let's go through all the versions of Sarah Connor as her arc evolved throughout the various timelines in the Terminator franchise. But before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Terminator Genesis, 2015. Even though Genesis is a very recent entry into the franchise, the movie is set in a timeline that is entirely off the usual Terminator timelines. So before we jump into our usual Linda Hamilton epicness, let's glance over at a time when Game of Thrones star Emilia Clarke decides to step into the shoes of Sarah Connor. Terminator Genesis might have been a complete reboot to the franchise, as it took us to a storyline where Kyle Reese headed back in time to protect Sarah Connor and instead found himself saved by her. Yes, it was a complete role reversal. The role reversal also involved a lovely Arnold Schwarzenegger moment, as one of his T-800s, Pops, had accompanied Sarah for a while. Another T-800 had arrived to kill her. So we got to see a somewhat okay version of the modern-day Arnold Schwarzenegger fight off against a CGI version of him, resembling him from the 1984 film. Even though we've seen Sarah have complicated relationships with the reprogrammed Terminators over the years, this timeline made it relatively easy for her. One of the T-1000s was sent to kill Sarah back in 1973 when she was just a 9-year-old girl, and following the tradition, a T-800 was also sent back to protect her. Even though her parents got killed by the T-1000, the reprogrammed T-800, or Pops, managed to save her, and ever since then, they grew a father-daughter-like bond. So instead of having the life-changing experience of absolutely hating machines, this Sarah managed to trust one of the machines at a very early age. She must have trauma about watching her parents being killed in her father's cabin by a T-1000, but somehow that aspect is never really covered here as much as other timelines show that. When she met Kyle Reese, Sarah introduced him to the makeshift time displacement equipment through which she intends to travel to 1997 and prevent Judgment Day, also stopping Skynet forever. Although these things make sense, the entire timeline is changed, and Kyle Reese has a different vision of what will be happening, and it's associated with something called Genesis, which will be released in 2017. So they decided to travel to 2017 instead and change things there based on the visions of Kyle Reese. Yeah, sure, I'll change my entire plan of saving humanity based on someone's visions that they saw while traveling in time. Anyway, they decide to jump into the TDE and head into the future, leaving behind Pops, who has already had some damage to his skin. So when they reach 2017, the authorities catch hold of them. But surprisingly, John Connor shows up, and Sarah takes her time to absorb all this. But before they can get into the crazy family reunion, it turns out that John has switched sides with Skynet and turned into T-3000 by Alex, who will be popularly added into another one of Matt Smith's poor usages in a movie. The center of the movie ends up being the changes, ensuring that Sarah doesn't end up sleeping with Kyle Reese. I'm not kidding. There are times when Arnold Schwarzenegger's T-800 tries to convince Sarah to make love with Kyle. There are moments when it feels like there's an angle for play here, but it all goes sideways, considering their offspring turned out to be a primary antagonist in the future. So in a way, it's better that they didn't go through the intended plan of conceiving John Connor. That just stopped everything for the time being in a way. Maybe that was the solution all along. Emilia Clarke does a good job with the character, even though she isn't given much chance to be explored compared to Linda Hamilton. She managed to bring the chemistry between her, Kyle Reese, and Pops into play. But what was interesting was the character's physicality. Considering this, Sarah Connor was already the warrior needed to protect John and kill some of the other Terminators that Skynet would send back in time. This timeline and its "let's not get them them together concept were never followed up, but we got another branch to the original timeline. The Terminator, 1984. In 1979, we got Ripley from Ridley Scott's Alien, and that almost started a wave of the best women in action films. What would follow was 1984's The Terminator, with Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor. Apart from being the first entry into a franchise that spawns various media projects, The Terminator uses Sarah Connor's character to guide our audience into the world of Terminators. Sarah Connor here is someone who had a very everyday life, working at a diner and getting the usual treatment until the entire damsel in distress scenario came into being, and we saw her go through the crazy journey of saving herself from being killed by Arnold Schwarzenegger's Terminator. Her disbelief and show regarding her circumstances are the key to her character, and they would set the trope for several Terminator films in the future. But then, none of them even brush close to Linda Hamilton's rendition of the girl trying to save herself from a killer robot from the future. When Kyle Reese arrives on the scene, it might feel for a second that she would be reduced to a sidekick in this time-traveling action piece, but she ends up being the heart of the story. We were not sure who the hero and the villain were, even though one was a lot more human than the other. It was not clear that John Connor would be Kyle and Sarah's son, and that's why their romantic development didn't come up as something surprising, but later on, it might have felt a bit rushed. At the end of the day, Kyle dies, and Sarah ends up killing the T-800 by herself, so she just needs to know what is wrong, and that's when she gets into the zone of killing robots, something she will continue for a while. Before we jump into Sarah Connor's future growth, it should be evident that this is her character at the most innocent she could be. The entire ordeal would traumatize her to the level that she would start having nightmares about the future that Kyle Reese described. At the same time, she would also be scared about her fate, along with that of her child, the future leader, John Connor. The Terminator Endgame, 1992. The three-issue comic book Endgame follows the arc where a Terminator is sent to the timeline in order to hunt down Sarah Connor, right around the time she's supposed to give birth to John Connor. Even though we've been used to Sarah Connor being the center of the plotline, other people carry the story as Sarah's life becomes essential. While the main characters are trying to look out for the Terminator, who's gone into a killer frenzy and is destroying anything in its path, Sarah hides herself away from all this, completely dedicated to ensuring John's safe birth. It became a harrowing ordeal as they tried to find her. Finally, the battle takes place inside a hospital as the Terminator goes through multiple people to prevent John's birth, but it's finally destroyed. Even though this means the end of the story, the timeline is wholly branched out when we find that the child that Sarah has given birth to isn't a boy, but instead a girl, Jane Connor. Terminator 2 Judgment Day, 1991. In Terminator 2 Judgment Day, 1991, Sarah Connor undergoes a significant transformation that showcases her growth from the ordinary young woman she was in the first film into a hardened, almost obsessive warrior driven by her singular mission to prevent Judgment Day and stop the rise of Skynet. This evolution reflects both her increasing paranoia and the intensity of her commitment to save humanity, even at the cost of whatever bit of humanity was left within her. At the start of Terminator 2, we see a very different Sarah Connor from the one we knew in the original 1984 film. No longer the frightened waitress running for her life, Sarah has become a battle-hardened survivor, utterly consumed by her knowledge of the coming apocalypse. Her experiences with the Terminator and the revelations about the future have fundamentally changed her, making her deeply paranoid and fiercely determined. She's no longer just concerned about protecting her son John, but is now obsessed with stopping Skynet's creation and saving 3 billion lives. This single-minded focus has led her to a mental institution where she's being held after trying to blow up a computer factory, a drastic measure that illustrates how far she's willing to go. The depth of Sarah's paranoia is evident in her every action. She's constantly on edge, distrustful of everyone, and willing to resort to extreme violence to achieve her goals. Her obsession with stopping Skynet has made her hyper-aware of any potential threats, and she sees danger everywhere. When the T-800 T-800, now reprogrammed to protect John, first arrives, Sarah immediately assumes it's there to kill her. Her first instinct is to attack or escape, driven by a deep mistrust born from years of fighting a seemingly invisible enemy. This intense paranoia is also evident in how she reacts to everyone involved in the creation of Skynet, especially Miles Dyson, whom she initially sees only as a target that must be eliminated. As the film progresses, Sarah's transformation continues. Her obsession with preventing Judgment Day reaches a peak when she decides to assassinate Dyson, believing that killing him will prevent the development of Skynet. This act represents a moral descent. Sarah is so driven by fear and the need to protect the future that she's willing to murder an innocent man. The scene at Dyson's home is a critical turning point, as it shows how far she's come from the compassionate woman of the first film. However, when faced with Dyson's terrified family, Sarah's humanity begins to resurface. She realizes that she has become as cold and ruthless as the machines she despises, which forces her to reassess her methods and regain some of her humanity. Despite this moment of reflection, Sarah remains intensely serious and driven throughout the film. Her paranoia manifests not just in her actions, but in her demeanor. She's rarely seen smiling, and her interactions are mostly terse, direct, and focused on survival. Her body language and behavior convey a constant readiness for combat. She's always alert and always prepared for an attack, which highlights her relentless determination. Her physical transformation, including her muscular build and combat skills, reflects the intensity of her preparation for the war she knows is coming. By the end of Terminator 2, Sarah's growth is evident in the way she begins to understand that the future is not set in stone, and that they have the power to change it. Her experiences throughout the film help her move past her initial paranoia and extreme actions to a place of cautious hope. She realizes that John's role as a leader will not just be about fighting, but also about shaping a future where humanity chooses a different path. In the final moments, as she narrates her thoughts about an uncertain future, there's a sense of newfound belief that their actions can make a difference, showing her growth from a woman driven by fear and paranoia to one who dares to hope. Sarah Connor in Terminator 2 Judgment Day is a character who embodies both the effects of trauma and the resilience to rise above it. Her growth is marked by a deepening seriousness about the threat of Skynet, a willingness to take drastic actions, and a profound understanding of the moral complexities involved in her fight. Throughout this journey, she evolves from a traumatized, paranoid fighter to someone who recognizes that while the future is uncertain, it can be shaped by the choices they make in the present. Sarah after T-1000's failed assassination. Following Judgment Day, when the T-1000 had failed to kill John Connor, Sarah and John managed to settle down in New Orleans, but there was no end to their troubles yet. One day, the principal at John's school calls her, but when she reaches the school, she finds that a T-Infinity has already killed the principal and intended to kill Sarah, which doesn't make sense because John has already been born. Realizing that the Terminator had corrupted memory files, Sarah tried to reason with it, even though it was hell-bent on killing her. Right then, the younger John Connor and the older John Connor from the future arrived to rescue her as the T-Infinity was engaged with the T-850 Terminators. The older John Connor and Sarah devise a plan to destroy the T-Infinity so that he can use it to travel back to the future, but Skynet knows about their mistake and sends the Dire Wolf to kill the Terminator. Dire Wolf is a canine-based Terminator that Skynet created, and here they wanted to use it to clean up their mistake before the Terminator could reach the hands of the Resistance. Luckily, Kyle Reese arrives to destroy the Dire Wolf, finally allowing him and John to use the T-Infinity to return to the future. This moment marked the first time that Sarah saw Kyle Reese after the events of Terminator, where he died after changing her life forever. Sarah was genuinely shocked, considering Kyle was as young as her son, yet the circumstances forced her to focus on the objective at hand rather than coping with her feelings. The Sarah Connor Chronicles. The Sarah Connor Chronicles series brings a completely unique version of Sarah Connor that is much different from the original timeline, as it takes into consideration the elements of her arc, but also develops significant narratives. Following the events of Terminator 2 Judgment Day, the series explores Sarah's life as she continues her battle against Skynet while trying to protect her son John, the future leader of the human resistance. She tends to be overprotective at times, but that's justified justified by her various nightmares, something similar to Linda Hamilton's version of Sarah. Lena Headey takes on Sarah's role, and her portrayal brings a new dimension to Sarah, blending strength with vulnerability, and explores how the constant pressure of preparing for an inevitable war has shaped her psyche and relationships. Throughout the series, Sarah remains resolute in her mission to stop Skynet, but she's also depicted as more human and introspective than in the films. The show delves into Sarah's internal struggles, her fears, doubts, and the psychological toll of living in a perpetual state of readiness for a war that may or may not come. One of the most significant and poignant developments in Sarah Connor's arc is exploring her battle with cancer. Now, this adds a new layer of vulnerability to her character and serves as a reminder of her mortality, even as she fights to prevent humanity's future extinction. The cancer arc directly references Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines, where it was briefly mentioned that Sarah died of leukemia before the film's events. The series builds on this idea by delving into Sarah's struggle with the possibility that she, too, could face a terminal illness despite all her efforts to alter the future. The cancer arc is introduced in the second season when Sarah begins experiencing symptoms that could indicate she's developing breast cancer, a fear exacerbated by her constant exposure to stress and potentially dangerous environments. This storyline shows a side of Sarah rarely seen before, a warrior forced to confront her physical fragility and the very real possibility that she may not live long enough to see the war she had spent her entire life preparing for. It brings a sense of urgency and desperation to her mission. She becomes even more determined to destroy Skynet and secure John's future as quickly as possible, knowing that time might not be on her side. Another interesting aspect of the series is the presence of Cameron, a reprogrammed Terminator sent back to protect John, as it mirrors the dynamic from Terminator 2, where a Terminator becomes an unlikely ally, and yet there's never complete trust associated with him. However, the one thing that was an essential part of the character was her nightmares, and the series considers them as there are times when we are introduced to some crazy storylines in the nightmares. Lena Headey's interpretation of Sarah Connor is unique in its approach, distinguishing her from Linda Hamilton's iconic portrayal. While Hamilton's Sarah is a hardened soldier molded by her traumatic experiences, Headey's version explores Sarah's psychological depth and emotional complexity. Headey brings a quieter, more nuanced strength to the role, capturing the wariness and resilience of a woman who has been running and fighting for years. Old Lady Sarah in two different timelines. Any storyline that explored Sarah's arc after the events of T2 Judgment Day or other such narratives introduced the concept of the Old Lady Sarah. This rendition is something like the Old Man Logan thing, only each expanded universe had their intention with the character and her arc as she continued her battle against the machines and how she handled the reality that whatever she does won't affect the future of the timeline she is in. The S.M. Sterling books explored Sarah's arc as she trained John Connor to become the future leader of the Resistance, as she had heard from Kyle Reese. Even though she's physically fit to jump into battle herself, the years of going through it over and over again have also taken a toll on her, and she has become a lot more aware of that too. She remains a warrior, but begins to confront her own mortality, reflecting on the potential legacy she will leave behind. Another significant old Sarah Connor arc was in the 2019 film Dark Fate, as the movie marked Linda Hamilton's return to the character after quite a while. Since the film acts as a direct sequel to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, it ignores the events of the other sequels, setting up a new timeline. After stopping Judgment Day in 1997, Sarah's life takes a tragic turn when another Terminator sent by Skynet kills her son John in 1998. This loss profoundly affects her, turning her into a bitter and relentless hunter of Terminators. By the time we meet Sarah in Dark Fate, she's in her 60s and has dedicated her life to tracking and destroying Terminators sent back in time, following cryptic messages sent to her by an unknown source. In this storyline, Sarah is a hardened survivor who has become even more cynical and driven by vengeance. Her character arc in Dark Fate revolves around her coming to terms with John's John's death and finding a new purpose in protecting Danny Ramos, a young woman targeted by a new form of Terminator, the Rev-9. Sarah's role shifts from being solely focused on revenge to recognizing her continued importance in the fight against the machines and mentoring the next generation. Linda Hamilton's portrayal of the older Sarah is gritty and intense. She captures the character's deep trauma, anger, and grief, but also her unwavering commitment to the cause. Fans continued to wonder about the character, and when the Prophet was introduced in the latest addition to the Terminator franchise, Terminator Zero, people did wonder if it was Sarah herself taking on a more Oracle-like role here. Based on her understanding of knowledge about timelines and all things time travel, it won't be surprising if Sarah becomes one of the wise ones and guides others in the future, taking some steps back from being more hands-on in the battle against the machines. The fate of Sarah in movies. Terminator 3: Rise of the Machines didn't intend to bring Sarah to the front. Instead, it wanted to focus on saving another duo, including a more mature John Connor. But her character is stated to have died due to leukemia a few days after the events of T2 Judgment Day. The problem lies in the idea that you can get rid of Sarah Connor, but her presence is felt throughout the film as John is a key character in the story himself. According to the film, Sarah left the mass of the weapons and other resources she had gathered for the fight against the machines to John, and that was enough to prove that even though she was sick and death was looming over her, she hadn't given up on her fight for the fate of humanity. Marvelous verdict. One might notice that each rendition of her arc had a unique storyline, and we witnessed how much Sarah Connor matured over time as her arc progressed. While she was oblivious to the entire war at the beginning, she ended up being a key soldier in the future, and someone who trained others for the sake of the future. Remember that comparison we talked about between Ripley and Sarah? It makes us wonder if they can come together as a force to be reckoned with in a storyline much like Thelma and Louise. Yeah, that would be a fantastic story. But I ask you, who would be Thelma and who would be Louise? And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.